Welcome to the WiLD Conversation, and in this half-truth series that we've been in, and today we're going to talk about the half-truth of authenticity. What an important time in our history to be talking about this, and it's a word that gets thrown around so often that we're going to dive into and do some deeper thinking and crowdsource some brilliance together as we think about what it means to be authentic. So it's interesting to think about. I had a conversation yesterday with someone who said, I was on this call with this guy and he was talking about actually something that was philosophically pretty deep and important. But he said it started to feel a little bit salesy and it started to feel like he was trying to sell me something. And it's funny because he said it just didn't feel authentic. It didn't feel genuine. And it causes me to be curious about what is it about something that feels like that causes us to say, like, is this authentic? Is this the real deal? And so we experience this all the time, or even when we ask someone, we say, how you doing? And someone says, hey, I'm great. It's great. Things are great. And you're thinking to yourself, that didn't feel real. Like, what's going on there? As opposed to, hey, things are great. Could be better. But what is that about? I would say that for myself, this question of authenticity matters because, I've mentioned before that I'm the person who can be really awkward at parties. My wife and I tease each other that she's someone who hates the ideas of parties, but she actually is really great when she gets there. I'm a person who loves the idea of a party, and I'm a disaster when I get there because I really have a first and a sixth gear. So I have one gear that's like, I could talk about video games and Call of Duty with 14-year-olds and some of that. That's one gear, my first gear. My sixth gear is like where I go a little bit too deep for most people to be comfortable. Instead of asking you like, hey, how's your work? Or how's your family doing? Or some small talk we might have on a golf course. I don't golf, but if we did, instead I'll ask questions like, hey, what do you do when you're not here? Which is my way of asking, so what's your work like? But I found that asking people about their work is awkward because sometimes the real story is, not working right now. So what do you do when you're not here seems safer, but weird. Or I'll ask like, hey, do you feel extroverted right now in this party? Which is also a strange question. And then if I really am feeling deeply philosophical, I might say, what is God saying to you lately? So I'm the person that you want to run from at a party. But that's my sixth gear. But I think what's interesting about this term authenticity, we throw it around often, is I've also thought over the years, I have a colleague I worked with for years, and he and I would always say, hey, can't you be a really authentic jerk? Maybe so, or maybe not. But it's interesting to think about, like, authenticity, if we just throw it around. Let's be our authentic selves. Well, what if my authentic self is kind of a jerk? Or at least in a season. That's something interesting. So I want to get into, let's talk for a moment about authenticity and some definitions of what it means. I love, as you know, I love breaking down these things that we sort of throw around and saying, what did this mean before culture took hold of it? What does it mean to be authentic? Here's a couple of definitions that are very interesting. Number one, worthy of acceptance or belief as conforming to or based on fact. Number two, conforming to an original so as to reproduce essential features. I think that's fascinating. Conforming to an original. I'm going to come back to that. Number three, made or done the same way as an original. Interesting. Number four, not false or imitation, real, actual. Number five, true to one's own personality, spirit, or character. And then number six, listen to this word again that comes up. Having an origin supported by unquestionable evidence, authenticated or verified. Having an origin supported by the evidence. Unquestionable evidence. And I think what's fascinating is that a few of these definitions actually root back to, or get back to, what is the root of it? What is that, the thing of origin that we're actually talking about? What is it? What is that fundamental thing? And here's what I want to suggest to us. The reason why this is so important, instead of the way we just throw it around, like be an authentic leader or be your authentic self, is that it calls out a really important question about what it means. What does that mean? And I would suggest even further, what does it mean to be human? When we think about these definitions, that conforming to an original so as to reproduce essential features, what is that original? And I think the question of what it means to be human and our assumptions about that are pretty important when we think about, now I'm coming back to the surface, around what it means to develop leaders. And this question of what it means to be human is interesting also from the perspective of research, because when we've studied the developmental journey of leaders, and I'll tell you in my own experience, when people start to tell their authentic story, it's not only full of good things. That our story, our human story, kind of our, and we mentioned a couple weeks ago when we talked about what does it mean to be human, we did a session on that, is that the root of the word human quite literally means from the dirt. Like, that to be human is actually to lower ourselves. Think of the word humility. That it's not just ascension that defines us and success, but it's also our humanness, our humility, the part, the lower part of ourselves. What it means to do that is really important to consider. So when we hear things like just be yourself, all the good stuff is in just being yourself. Just lean in, just do it. That is actually only part of the story, and that a more whole look at the concept of authenticity would include a very, I guess, some clear thinking or some deeper thinking about what it means to be our authentic selves. What does that really look like? Because our authentic selves are full of different things. So let me talk about for a moment about there's a couple of guys, Fred Luthans, and a professor and researcher, and Bruce Avolio, who's a friend of mine over at the University of Washington, have done a lot of work in the space of authentic leadership. And I think this is really important work. And I would say that one thing that they mention is that authentic leadership, that concept, was born out of positive psychology, and positive psychology was born out of, now, and when you think of positive psych, you may think of things like the appreciative inquiry, or a focus on potential that's out there, or even a focus on strengths, some of the Gallup work that came out, which is important. But realize this, that the emphasis on these positive attributes or thinking in that way came as a reaction against decades of work in things like psychotherapy, where we focused on pathology and things about people that were broken. Now, what I would suggest is that positive psychology is not the only way, but it's a reaction against, and I think the whole story of what authenticity looks like is probably includes both. Though we know a lot of research would suggest, by the way, that leaders don't tend to derail, especially executive leaders, because they fail to leverage their strengths, but oftentimes it's because they have a limited capacity to see their blind spots. So that both, and in terms of our brokenness and our beauty and our redemptive possibilities, is important when we think about developing a leader. And when you come from that standpoint of what it means to be human, this is why vulnerability is taken off, by the way. Because when we see their story of brokenness and beauty is when we start to really connect into them, which is interesting. And it changes everything. Think of how it changes when we change our lens, saying that people are all good and that we're trying to get back to that, as opposed to our real story is a very interesting and wild story, that it might even change the way we think about things like competence or purpose. And I think that foundation of where we begin, it matters. So in this area of authentic leadership, I want to read you something that I think is really interesting. So one thing that Bruce and Fred describe is as a positive construct. This is getting at the concept of authentic leadership. Descriptive words include genuine, reliable, trustworthy, real, and veritable. Veritable meaning it sort of puts a little heavier emphasis on what actual means, like a veritable river. It's often used in reference to metaphorical kinds of things. It's a powerful word, and that those things are important. That we see those things, and then read those again. Genuine, reliable, trustworthy, real, and veritable. Those things matter. But I would also suggest, and they go on to make some really interesting statements about what it means in situations where there's a lack of leaders, or a lack of that connection between what they describe as espoused values, action, and behaviors, where there's a disconnect and it feels disingenuous or not authentic. That this is a powerful statement in their writing as well, is that in those kinds of situations, there's almost a vacuum of principles, and therefore some of these places that are where that vacuum is there's a lack of that consistency between what we say who we say we are and what we're actually doing. Is that we stop looking for authentic leaders, and what we start to look for is charismatic leaders, and that can be a dangerous path. We see some of that in our culture today, and us being drawn to memes or quick, tweetable statements as opposed to the deeper story. But this is what I want to suggest to you, is coming back to my point in the beginning, is what does it mean to be human? When you look at that list of words like genuine, reliable, trustworthy, real, and veritable, let me ask you this. Are you trustworthy, real, reliable, veritable, genuine? And I think most of us, if we admitted it and we were honest with ourselves, would say, no, I'm not wholly those things. And what was fascinating, I had a conversation yesterday with a friend of mine, and I told him, I said, I look at that and I say, no, I'm not those things. And he said, what? To me, you are. But that's his perception of me. Am I always trustworthy to him or to anyone? And I'm aware of my own story that includes all those good things, but it also includes some brokenness, some things that are fragmented. And what I want to suggest is this, is that the concept of whole, of being whole, and being our authentic selves is an aspiration. It's a very important aspiration. In the same way that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, or other amazing countries, like even the Indian Constitution, because I spent a lot of time in India, is an aspirational document that is full of complexity. And that's an important aspiration. But what happens so often is that our real story feels like, if you think of an aspiration like this, of our wholeness as like a circle, that our real story is more of a clumped up puzzle piece. That our real story, the complexity of it, and kind of the messiness sometimes. And so I think this is why in culture so often, where we see something that's a statement or like a principle, or here's the 5 ways to lead well, or we talk about leadership instead of actual people, or we put out these ideals of just be yourself, that those things fall flat, because when they bump up against our reality, they might make sense and we want that, but it doesn't stick. There's no place for it to grab hold. And I think this is also why there's so much power in vulnerability, in moments where we might share something. And that it changes our whole perspective on what whole leader development is, and even the application of science around that, when we begin to think intentionally about what is the real human experience. Because I can tell you, after conversations I've had with so many people in the last few weeks, or in the decades of research on this, that people's stories include both brokenness and beauty. They include failures, some really difficult failures. They include setbacks. They include places where they have both won and succeeded and ascended, but also places of deep descent into their own character and questions about who they are. So that is what our more authentic thing is. It connects better when we're getting a little bit more real. And all the things we think about in leader development capacity become, they look differently when we go down that path. So here are some things to give you some handholds onto this. If you want some more specific kinds of things, these are 5 different, I call them the 5 P's of what it means to become wholly authentic. And as we launch out into conversations all week about this, or in the weeks ahead, here are some things to think about. First of all, the first P is people. The concept of authenticity does not occur in a vacuum. I would suggest, unless you live your life in a cloister, as Thomas Merton said, and none of us do, that actually authenticity is developed in community. Anybody who's in a close relationship or married knows what I'm talking about. That for me to show up as my authentic self in my own marriage would mean to understand my wife's development and her authentic self, and that who I am is affected by my environment and the people that I surround myself with. That I'm not dismissing the power of saying be your authentic self, but that misses an entirely separate and important part of the picture. Actually, an integrated part of the picture is that our authentic selves happen in community together. And the question I would ask is this, like, what would it mean? How would it might, or here it is, who is helping you understand your authentic self in this season, and how are you doing the same for them? Because I think our authentic self also changes. The second thing is process. Related to that is process, the second P. How would your perspective on your authentic self change if you embraced it as a journey with stops along the way instead of just simply a destination? Of suddenly I become myself. A journey with stops along the way. So there are moments of destination, but it keeps going. And we continue to change, but there still is a root and a core of who we are. The third thing is persona. This concept that how is who you are expecting yourself to be, how is that impacting, and how you are shaping yourself in the perspective of others and what they expect you to be, how is that impacting you? This concept of identity is so interesting. And here's another way of thinking about it. What is changing about you that is inspiring to you and maybe inspiring to others around you? As you open up your real story, your real wild story, the surprising, unexpected parts of your story, the parts that are hard to tell, the parts of yourself, of your persona that and your identity that have been affected by challenging things that you whisper out loud or that scream out inside of you. The fourth thing is portfolio. What experiences are you having right now? And what are you learning that you would like to be intentional about, that are affecting you? You'd like to take a more intentional look at those things. And then finally, this is presence. The last P is if you showed up as your more wholly authentic self in this season, as you're on this journey, how might that inspire or encourage others around you? So I think what I'm suggesting is the half truth is that we throw authenticity out there, but thinking more deeply about our authentic story is that it's messy, and it is critically important. It is critically important that we think about both our brokenness and our beauty. This is where we get into issues about what do I need to take responsibility for. Not all of us. It's not all good at that fundamental level, but there's a lot of good. And I think this is where the true pathway towards an amazing redemption. But even more like if we go to the practical level of leader development, what would it look like if our organizations were places where we were invited to take more responsibility for ourselves, for our contribution, because we all have something to own, but also something to understand. And so I think as we get more deeply into authenticity, it will release something. So I'm excited for the conversation that you'll be having, hopefully throughout the week and through the coming weeks. What does it really mean to be authentic? That's what I would suggest we continue to talk about. What does it really mean to be authentic?